Senior Lecturer in Cultural and Media Studies, is that right? At Central Lancashire, the University of Central Lancashire. Anandhi has done a lot of work around the Asian youth movements over the years, including creating an online archive. And it's a real pleasure for us to host this event of the launch of Anandhi's new book. So, take it away.
Well, thank you all of you for coming, and I know that I'm speaking to quite a mixed audience, some of whom were members of the youth movement, and so I hope that I will talk for a while, but hopefully we can have some discussion, and those of you that were involved in that movement and in the anti-racist movement more broadly can be involved as well. This book is about a movement of young South Asians in Britain who, classed as a problem by the state and faced with racist violence on the street, were determined to struggle for the right to be treated as equal citizens, the right to live in peace, and the right to live here with their families. It's a history that gives testament to the power of community organisation and the possibilities of political solidarity to win campaigns and struggles for justice. In 2001, following the start of the War on Terror, the ways that South Asians were framed with reference to faith became so all-pervasive in a discourse that already constructed South Asians being bound by unchangeable
the other thing that I should say is that when I first began,
and this history challenges that representation and gives testament to a political identity of history that was framed not by cultural or religious identities, but by a left tradition and anti-imperialism. The research, as Jackie mentioned, began in the collection of an archive. I set out to preserve the documents of this history, in a sense to act as a resource that would counteract the kind of dominant ways in which South Asians were being presented. And I also collected oral testimonies, and I will share some of them with you today as part of a DVD that was produced. And the oral testimonies are a very strong feature
became
in the
so
book, because I guess
all-pervasive.
I have a sort of, in a discourse on this, in people's history, should, in a sense, be have the voices of the people, the participants of that history and that period. So I've tried to do that. The other thing that I should say is that when I first began this, because I kind of was influenced in collecting the material because of this whole sort of faith thing, the first article that I wrote was titled "The Secular Identities of the Asian Youth Movement." But as time went on, such a framework had to be reconsidered in response to the adoption of this history, that's including the history of the Asian youth movements, as a way of blaming Muslims for the rise of Islamophobia in texts like Keenan Malik's Fatwa to Jihad. So I knew, having been someone that was involved later on in the anti-racist movement and very familiar with many of the participants of the movement in the 70s and 80s, that those that had been involved in that movement would wish to defend those experiencing discrimination and would frame any debate within an anti-imperialist analysis. So that made me reconsider what was the core of their political identity. Although they were secular, secularism was never professed, because the core of their identity was very much that of a black political identity. And this history challenges that representation and gives testament to a political identity, black anti-imperialist identity, in which, and in this, they were responding very much to living in Britain. So from that point of view, it was about it was a British identity. It was about believing that they had the right to live here as equal citizens. It wasn't about extricating themselves from the society, which is another way that South Asians have tended to be represented. When we think about their slogans, "Come what may, we're here to stay," "Black people must unite," "Here to stay, here to fight," we can see that this is about being here and being treated equally as part of this society. And that was also important because previous expressions of political involvement by South Asians, and there is a history of that, and that's another important thing to remember. You know, we have a history of involvement in politics in this country. Previous organisations by South Asians, like the Indian Workers Association, had been rooted much more in subcontinental politics. The Indian Workers Associations were connected directly to the various Indian communist parties, for example. So this was about a British identity. The Asian youth movements that formed in Bradford, Sheffield, Manchester, Coventry, Leicester, Birmingham and London, as well as in small towns such as Bolton, Burnley, Luton and Watford, were mainly made up of young men.
Not by
entirely
identity,
We have one
but
very
very
important member
tradition
in the audience
and that
who was
the
very
research
important
is Jackie
in
May.
the Asian youth movement in Manchester and in what was in fact the women's wing in Manchester, sitting in the audience with us here today. So while many of those members were of college age, they included individuals that were as young as 15 and others that were in their late 20s, that had experience of political organisation both in this country as well as back home. They didn't have fixed age restrictions, but wanted to create organisations to represent the concerns of young South Asians and their families. And in that sense, they were organisations of youth, but not simply for youth, because they took up issues that impacted on their communities. In organising themselves as a movement, they were different to the other news, or some of the other new social movements at the time, since they didn't wish to challenge the importance of class as the basis for political organisation, but wanted to highlight the importance of tackling racism within the class struggle. But where they did have the characteristics of a movement was in the broad-based nature of these organisations that varied from city to city, influenced by the specific character and histories of those locations that they lived in, worked in.
The documents of this history, in a sense, to act
So in the book,
as a resource
show you
that would counteract the kind of dominant ways in which
I look at the birth of the youth movements and why they formed, how they spread. I then look at the kind of identity, political identity that they had, and the kind of networks of solidarity that they worked in, and then focus on some of the key issues that they campaigned on. One was the immigration laws, which they fought quite a lot of different campaigns in order to focus on the nature of racism as not simply being that of sort of racist violence on the street or an individual racism, but state racism. The case of the Bradford 12, which enshrined the right of a community to self-defense. And then I look at why they disintegrated, or how they disintegrated, the impact and the influences on the disintegration of what was
oral testimonies,
very
and I
powerful
will share some of them with you today as part of the DVD.
and that was reflective on the lessons and legacies of that movement for today. Today I'm going to show you just 10 minutes which have some interviews with individuals that talk about how they formed the movement, why they organised. And so I'm going to just show you that, and then I will talk a little bit about their identity, the political identity, a bit about the Bradford 12, and then a few reflections perhaps about their lessons and legacies.
Socialist papers and the left papers and the Marxist literature and also the non-Marxist literature. We were reading a lot by the time I was 17, 18, I was reading all sorts of stuff. I'd be in the library in the Krakow, as soon as it opened, and I'd be there until it closed. because there used to be a cafeteria in the library, so I could eat there as well. And I'd wait until friends came in and buy me some soup and bread and things like that. So I virtually lived in a library. And because I was surrounded by books, I just read a lot. I had nothing else to do during the day. Didn't have family, didn't have homes, and I just read as much as I could. And I began to understand that the world I lived in was really fundamentally unfair. I began to understand that this country was rich because we were poor. And I also began to understand that we were here because they were there, and I really believed in that.
The activity of the National Front and how they were mobilising and wanting to sort of essentially repatriate the Asian community, all this talk about the Asian community stealing our jobs, stealing our homes, stealing our women, that kind of stuff that was going on. So it was really, in part, I suppose, to defend our homes. They used to come into our sort of area. And in fact, in 1976, the National Front decided to hold a meeting in a school in the heart of where we lived.
And the march, the big anti-fascist march led by sort of the leaders of the time, ended up in the city centre now. We lived in Manningham, or lots of us lived in Manningham. We marched to Manningham, broke through police lines, ran, sneaked, because Manningham was ours, and we had to protect it.
That was my first recollection of a riot in Bradford, basically, where police cars were turned over, paint was thrown at them, and being chased by, police on horseback. It was there that we really started thinking we've got to get our own house in order. That was, I suppose,
You see the way in which the movements have spread in lots of different towns and cities, forming right from 76 on until 1982. And one of the key issues for them was the right to self-defense and their need to defend themselves and their communities. Also, particularly you see it in the Sheffield experience, the importance of challenging police criminalisation of the youth, and also the conflicts that they had with the British left. Because one argument could have been, work within the left and work within those organisations to fight these struggles. But we can see the way in which sometimes for the left issues were raised, but not necessarily strategies were employed to actually defeat the fascists off the street or to challenge them actually on the street. And so for young Asians, there was a need to actually to focus on that, to challenge racists that were coming into their communities and challenge the right for them to be able to walk the streets themselves. Okay. I've mentioned their sort of black political identity, and when you look through the leaflets and posters and in the discussions and interviews that I've done and shared, it's clear that they were influenced by a whole host of organisations that experienced the Black Power movement in America.
And she said
It was for many of us
the happiest time of our life.
A whole
Because
variety
we will find
of national liberation movements as well as workers' struggles, and they took part in those struggles and built links between them. The poster in the middle is one that was produced in Sheffield, where they talk about their own victimisation, criminalisation by the police, link that to the experience of the Irish and Republicans, and also to the miners, arguing that it's no coincidence, so the importance of building all that solidarity. And of course, for South Asians, even within their own family, the experience of colonialism was strong. Parents and grandparents had been within the British Army, the families had experienced partition, had migrated through colonialism, sometimes to Africa and then to Britain or to here. So all of those experiences as well, that knowledge, in a sense, it was part of community knowledge as well as a broader history. And they drew on that, and you can see that in this poster that was produced by Birmingham, the Asian Youth Movement, making the link between the anti-colonial freedom fighter Udham Singh and the struggle for the Bradford 12. So whatever the language used, I won't say too much about immigration cases, but just to highlight the fact that when we look at what they achieved, and when we look at how many struggles, how many immigration campaigns they won, they clearly had a very good strategy and approach. One thing that they did was that they used cases to highlight broader issues. So, for example, the case of Anwar Ditta, they used that to highlight the injustice of the immigration laws, and they always worked on a grassroots level, involving communities, as you can see, for example, in that photograph. It wasn't just about, again, raising an issue; it was about winning it. And if there was no legal avenue, then they would find another way. And with Anwar Ditta, in fact, she lost the legal right of appeal, but the campaign didn't stop there, and it didn't stop until they won. There were lots of debates about whether they should be involved in single-issue campaigns or broader campaigns, for example, linking different immigration cases. In Bradford and in Manchester, both the Asian Youth Movement and other anti-racists were involved in joint campaigns, some of which were successful and some of which were not. I think it's interesting, though, when you look at the way the Asian youth movements were never apologetic about what they were doing. They didn't just want to see people as victims, but they wanted to argue for their rights. And I'm just going to read a statement that when you look at the Defend the Bradford 18, there was 18 people that were going to be deported from Bradford, the statement that was in their leaflet, and when you bear in mind that they won their campaigns in contrast to, for example, the Bangladesh Divided Family campaign in Manchester, which unfortunately did not. You can see how they focused so much on their right and the importance of struggling for that. The government is following a policy of mass expulsions and mass repatriations by the back door. The Home Office will not listen to any argument about justice and humanity. The black community must stand up and support them, because you may be next and there might be nobody left to fight for you. So the point is that you have to do this. It's important. Build a solidarity. And yeah. Well, this was on.
This was yours.
It's really important for me just to say a few words about, well, not for me, but it's really important to say a few words about the Bradford 12, the significance of the case. And one really interesting thing is when you look at the histories about struggles, about police criminalisation, all of those things, stuff that's been written already. You know, I have been puzzled by why the Bradford 12 has been so little written about. Because, you know, when you think of the significance of the campaign and the trial, for those of you that don't know, and excuse me, you know, if you know this history well, in 1981, following their upheavals, dozens of towns were about 12 young Asian men, members of the United Black Youth, were arrested on charges of conspiracy to make explosives and endanger lives, in a case that became known as the Bradford 12. The case centred around half a crate of Molotov cocktails that were made but never used by the defendants. From the beginning, it was clear through the presence of Special Branch and the kinds of questions that the key defendants were asked that this was a political trial and was an attempt by the state to criminalise young men that had taken part in legal forms of protest and acted to defend their communities over the past 5 years. While the early campaign focused on the issue of police conspiracy, in court the defendants argued that they had made the bombs in self-defence of their community. The case and the campaign were again to prove the power of grassroots organisation and networking. The calls for support outlined the support that the defendants had given to others in order to galvanise the widest cross-section of support, and they succeeded. And I just put this slide in of the hundreds of organisations that were listed that supported them. This was in a document produced by Leeds Other Paper when they won their campaign. Organisations that included workers' organisations, socialist organisations, communist parties, temples,
And in Manchester,
Manchester, national liberation organisations, women's groups, law centres, film cooperatives, feminist and socialist publishers, disabled groups, student organisations, you name it. They managed to galvanise that support. And that was because of the way in which they had operated for the previous 5 years, building links, building unity. And of course as well because people wanted to campaign at that particular moment in 1981 and 1982 against the state victimisation of activists. But the campaign didn't operate in isolation. That was one of the things that, they used every strategy to win the case. They had a very supportive legal team that worked with the campaign, and the campaign as well supported that legal team to produce detailed reports about racist violence in Bradford. So in order to understand how the picture in Bradford worked in relation to the national picture. And so all of this, that in a sense, it was the interlinking and the supportive relationship that existed that was part of the success, as well as, of course, being able to expose the levels of police racism and corruption. With, for example, Deputy CID of Bradford, who had been in charge of the criminal investigation of the Bradford 12, being exposed as having made statements such as, police officers must be prejudiced and discriminatory to do their job. Searching long-haired youth in bedraggled clothing produces drug seizures, and searching West Indian youth wearing tea-cosy hats and loitering in city centres could detect mugging offences. The victory of the acquittal, of course, was marred by the destruction of an organisation, the United Black Youth League, that had made a conscious decision to stand outside of the state structures and to operate as an independent organisation in fighting racism and discrimination. And that brings me to the point of one of the points of why these organisations in the 1980s did begin to disintegrate. After the riots of 1981, we're all aware of Scarman's report and the influence of that and the influence of state funding. Even before Scarman's report, it was clear that the state were aware that they needed to control a radical political organisation. And Heseltine's report, as early as August 1981, It Took a Riot, talks about the need to organise communities and in order to stop them being influenced by what he described as the hard left. And we see through the 80s this the increase of funding that leads to, in a sense, the disintegration of the independence of these organisations. And not only that, there's a disintegration of the black political identity through which they had galvanised and worked together with Africans, Caribbeans, and others. And, for example, in 1982, following the Bradford 12 campaign, Luton Youth Movement was formed. And when the funding sources came in, so just a year or two later, the group divided into the Pakistani Youth Forum and the Bangladeshi Youth League. And in fact, these two organisations still exist. Because everything within the way in which the funding criteria operated was to argue for people to defend their need on the basis of particular identities and cultures. So you see this process of disintegration taking place. I just want to finish by thinking about today, the way in which racism is reconfigured, and the lessons and legacies of the youth movement. Clearly, there's a power of solidarity, the power of grassroots campaigning, the power of independent organisations, and also the right to self-defence is proved. And we see in 2001, in the 2001 riots that took place in Bradford, Burnley, and Oldham, which was again a response to fascist violence. This time, there were no organisations in the town to defend the youth. And the lack of an organised left, both within the South Asian community and outside it, left the youth of Bradford with little support. As Ruth Bundy, the solicitor for Anwar Ditta, as well as for 6 of the Bradford 12, has reflected, that in 1981, it was the sons of the community that were on trial. In 2001, that feeling did not exist. But what did exist and has continued is the belief in the right to be here and to stay here. And that really should make us think again about the way in which everything has always been analysed in terms of communities wishing to segregate, etc. Because when you look at some of the interviews that have been done with young people on the streets in 2001, I will just read you one. They, the elders, always saw themselves as outsiders, whereas the youth of today believe that they have the right to stay here. We were born here. We contribute to society, to the communities. This is our home. We might be a Pakistani minority, but we are British citizens, and we are British, so we deserve equality and everything. The extraordinary thing is, and in another quote, they talk about the parents' intentions of being different. Yet the extraordinary thing is, as in these parents were of that Asian youth movement generation. And they were saying exactly the same things in the 70s and 80s. They were talking about wanting to belong here. And that's what their slogan said, here to stay, here to fight. Black people have the right here to stay, here to fight. So it's a lesson, to think that in fact that the young people today are saying the same things. So it's not just simply something that's internal to the community that we need to think about, but in a sense, clearly, the racism that's existing within Britain. I want to finish as a reflection on the importance of this period, to finish on a statement that Gareth Pearce made, who was solicitor for 6 of the Bradford 12, at a 30th anniversary commemoration of Bradford 12 in 2011. She is now solicitor as well for Babar Ahmed, Shekhar Ahmed and Talha Asif, who have had their human rights denied, not just social rights, as a result of the anti-terror legislation. And she said, "It was for many of us the happiest time of our life, because we were fighting a war on the same side. And when you're involved in that fight, the bonds you make are the strongest bonds you will ever make in your life. We owe it to them, that line of history, that gives us still some hope in saying that whatever the language used, however the false narrative sustained, whatever it is in the world, that we are party to the same disgraceful injustice of calling self-defense something different. We absolutely owe it to you, our thanks, for teaching us how to struggle for the truth."
Anyone to share? Or I I assume you're ready to take questions and happy to
Yeah,
have a
sure,
conversation.
yeah.
It's kind of a lot of
Yeah.
people, so I don't know whether you
That's
want me to
fine.
do that role or do it yourself. Or what. Can I say,
Yeah.
speaking as someone who's, you know, working at the Race Relations Resource Centre, just amazing. Thank you so much. Not just for tonight, but actually for your collection of all that primary source material. It's just astonishing. Astonishing. It's fantastic that it hasn't been allowed to be lost. I appreciate your work. I'm sure there's
Any
going to be lots of
questions, any comments? I mean, there's people that were part of this history, more part of this history than I have been, so please contribute.
I know that this weekend the EDL are marching through Bradford. I was wondering what you thought about the movement and EDL reaction and the reaction.
What do I think about it? Well, obviously, does anyone else who would want to answer that question? Just Beard, do you want to comment?
What do you think about the EDL marching through Bradford?
Well, the reactions to that and kind of mobilisation in reaction to the EDL marching through these really prominent Asian areas. They do have marches through London as well. And
Personally, I think it's something which is disgusting. It disgusts me, and it's something which needs to be challenged. And in the same way that when we were members of the Asian Youth Movement, we challenged the National Front and the BNP in the later days. It's an organisation which I think it's a very complex organisation. It's built up in many different ways, but it needs to be challenged. It still espouses the same philosophy that the previous organisations did then as well. That's what I really want.
I just wanted to comment on the EDL trying to march through Ashton-under-Lyne. It's a little town. Ashton-under-Lyne. It's a little town up in Tayside, about 10 miles east of here. And on 2 occasions in the last 3 months, EDL tried to march through Ashton. And all we did was shut down. And they got absolutely no attention whatsoever. And they were so disappointed. And it was just really lovely to say up yours because nobody's coming.
That's one way.
That's one way.
It's not the only way.
It's not the only way.
One way.
But it was one way that actually we had to protect ourselves. Older ladies that were marching right in front of the big warehouse where we go shopping on a Saturday. We had to protect those older people.
So there was a kind of ring round.
So there was a kind of ring round and said, everybody shut your doors, everybody shut your banners, you know, shutters down, opening.
And they tried it again.
They said,
oh, we've got no reaction.
They said, oh, we've got no reaction the first time, let's try it again.
Same reaction.
And
I think there were
comments to say, oh, that's unusual.
So, there are lots of different.
There are lots of different. It's not necessarily the way I would do it,
but it was a way of protecting.
But it was a way of protecting the community, and it was a way of protecting a very small town. It wasn't like the Londons, the Leicesters, the Bradfords. There isn't the protection really necessarily.
So that's the way they handled it.
So that's the way they handled it.
First of all, I just want to thank you for talking today. I've kind of got 2 questions. First of all, I'm quite interested in the role of the sisters in the Asian Youth Movement. You mentioned something about the role that they had, particularly in Manchester, and the kind of presence that they had and their contributions and stuff like that. And second of all, I've kind of, been involved in a lot of anti-fascist stuff for the past 6 or 7 years, and it seems like a lot of the success of the movement historically, whether it was the Asian Youth Movement or in the States with the Black Panthers, is that these organisations were based on the principles of self-determination. So it was organised by the people who were enduring this particular kind of suffering, and that was intrinsic to the success of these movements. You've got a lot of the anti-fascist movement here, and when I go around when we're protesting against the BNP or the EDL or the National Front or whatever, and I don't see any black or brown faces. I'm only seeing white people. What's happened to the disintegration of these kind of self-defined movements like the Asian Youth Movement? Where are we? Why are we organising? Is it something within our own communities, or is there this kind of like maybe white privilege, Eurocentrism within the anti-fascist movement that we need to have a discussion about?
I think it's a whole mixture of things. And yet, we don't have. I mean, I think one thing I didn't talk about, and with the rise of Islamophobia, we saw, and that impacted generally on progressive struggles, and it impacted on the way in which, in the disintegration of black organisations, left organisations. And with the rise of Islamophobia, we saw the increase in the power, if you like, the authority and the voice of conservative organisations as well within our own communities. So it's not a singular thing. We've seen this process taking place very slowly. So, and so that means that we haven't got organisations that are defending, say, like we used in Bradford. It has become organised much more along faith lines. That doesn't necessarily mean that is how it will continue. It should be. We can raise a different voice.
I just wanted to say that somebody was part of the white left in the period of cover. I was reminded by the fact that the pictures that we showed that the anti-Nazi league concentrated on the far right, whereas the lesson that we learned from the Asian Youth Movement and some other black organisations is that really they were secondary. They fed off the racism of the state, and that's what we see now. I mean, on 1 week. A couple of weeks ago, the Home Office was telling asylum seekers to go home. And we can't be surprised that the most oppressed and disorganised section of the working class goes marching in the shape of the EDL. For a long time, there was a traditional left that just focused on the right without linking it to the responsibility of the state.
Yeah, I suppose it was like one of the things that the youth movement raised was that we shouldn't be just talking about anti-fascism, that we should be talking about anti-racism. You also mentioned, I didn't answer that question about women in the youth movements, and one of the criticisms about youth movements is that they were very macho, or maybe men, it's like they've got women to involve. At some levels that's true. So, for example, in Bradford was a racial without that. And in Manchester, they decided to have a women's week, and there was only sort of one woman involved. Organised separately, some women's and it was Italy, and they fell too. They wanted to try. But the thing is we also have to think about the historical period. When migrants came over, it was mainly men, and they brought their sons with them too, so because their sons could work. And some women were preferred to come to events that were at the beginning. There were women in the imbalance in the community, because there weren't that many women. And then, of course, when women did arrive, I guess, obviously there were traditions, and they weren't supposed to go out or whatever. But it wasn't fighting were about women. They were in terms of violence or all sorts of things. There was a large degree of a macho culture. But it was less the case in Bradford and in Manchester. And both Bradford and Manchester had incredibly developed aims and objectives because they were influenced by communist organisations. They were influenced by even like the Indian Workers Associations and stuff like that. And in there they argued that part of their own struggle should be the struggle for liberation, and that they couldn't achieve proper liberation of law without that. And in Manchester they decided to have a women's wing, and it was a small women's wing, as far as I understand. But they did organise separately, some women's events separately, and they felt, and they did that in order to try to involve women more broadly. They thought that some women would prefer to come to events that were women only or led by women. And also, of course, many of the immigration campaigns that they were fighting were about women. It was women that had suffered domestic violence or all sorts of things that were threatened with deportation. And so, of course, they would support those women more effectively by having a women's wing. So they did, there were, intellectual discussions and arguments, and there was a belief and a desire to involve women. It didn't always happen, perhaps to the extent that they would have wished. But there was a concerted effort, particularly in Manchester. Nilofer, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I think in that period there was also this restrictions from many especially because of the racism that we saw we were going out and we had to do a lot of. I know my mother always thought I was clubbing in the night, and I shouldn't believe me when I said I was flying posted till midnight. You went clubbing. No, she didn't. She used to always say, "You lied to me, you're clubbing." So I had to show her the posters and what have you. But it's just like that. So there was restrictions as well, and that's why I think the women's wing did help to encourage women to come, and also people who felt that it was their issues that we were obviously fighting around, so more women would get involved that way, and that was the idea.
I was most struck by the historical perspective you gave as well. It's so easy to forget. Background. Really, what I'd like to ask is, how much do you think the scenario has changed during the course of the last 50 years? Because the one thing that's very striking, like I say, is that the issues back then for the minorities remain exactly the same as these issues for today. And in fact, the vigour of hostility towards the minorities is a great deal more stronger than it was back then. One thing clearly has changed, and you're quite right, that the unity of black people has disappeared. Actually, even the Asian youth movement was part of that splitting, because it was a movement away from the Afro-Caribbeans. So one saw that division opening up in Bradford at that time. That's why it was the Asian youth movement. No, wait, just a second. What I think has happened since then is a further fragmentation, which you've emphasised. But what has been happening in that course of that fragmentation is actually that in all sorts of ways, resistance to everything that was happening amongst the majority has now coalesced into local ethnic colonies, which are more or less ethnically and above all religiously homogeneous. In other words, I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing, but what one does see is that there is ever more vigorous reaction on a local community, and in fact often a religious basis, against precisely the exclusionary processes that you've been showing us. Because it does seem to me that what's happened, if you look at ideas and assumptions amongst the indigenous majority, I can't see that there's much difference now from what there was then. I don't know how far you agree with that.
I think first thing in terms of the Asian youth movements is I think that Yes, you could say that they were separate and that they had a black identity, but they organized as Asians.
Yeah.
The reason, my understanding, that they organized as Asians because they felt that they could organize most effectively within their own communities. But they wanted to work and have links with, to work in solidarity with Africans and Caribbeans and others. You see that in Manchester, for example. The mailing address of the Asian Youth Movement in Manchester was the Abyssindi Cooperative. So the links were really strong. They were really strong, they were really powerful. And when the United Black Youth League was formed in Bradford, it, they didn't use the term Asian, they used the term black. They decided to make that link, and that was in 1981. At that very point when the Asian Youth Movement in Bradford decided to go for state funds, apply for state funds, and then got absorbed as time went on in the 80s with setting up youth centres and other kind of, involved even in terms of their campaigning work, in work that they could absorb into, if you like, council agendas, as opposed to ones that stood outside of that. So I don't think it's right to say that the Asian youth movements were a split from that broad black identity. I think the Asian youth movements in many senses showed the power of that unity because they were Asians and yet they said we're black. It was never a question. Nobody argued about whether they were black or not. And that was even after the youth movement ceased to exist. And it was really into the 90s that when many of us stopped using that term. Sometimes I will still use that term, except nobody understands what it is anymore, but I will still use that term.
I'm just going to say all the slogans if you see in the camp,
exactly.
They're all black people,
yeah.
We must unite to stay in finance, all those.
Yeah, Gus, please come.
My name is Gus John. I was for some years the chair of the Black Parents Movement in the city. I want to just add something to what you just said. That I missed some of your presentation. I've just arrived from London with these three folk who came in with me. I just want to say two or three things. The first is that the Asian Youth Movement had a very direct link with a radical black, as in African and African Caribbean politics. We, within the Race Today Collective and the Alliance of the Black Parents Movement and the Black Youth Movement, supported the Imperial Typewriter Strike, Grunwick. We worked very closely with the Indian Workers Association. And indeed, Race Today Collective was very critical in supporting the Bradford 12. Ruth Bundy, Ian MacDonald, Gareth Pierce worked with us on other issues to do with black youth. The Race Today Collective spawned the Bradford Black Collective. I was living in Bradford, teaching at the university there at the time, and our membership was of Caribbean people as well as members of the Asian Youth Movement. And that was replicated here in Manchester. So that when the Black Parents Movement and the AYM Manchester, including the sisters, particularly the sisters, launched a campaign to prevent the deportation of 3 women, all of whom had suffered domestic violence, including Nazreen Akhtar and Jaswinder Kaur. That was a jointly led campaign by the Black Parents Movement and the AYM. And similarly, when the AYM had their issues with Manchester City Council, who was engaging in some really dire divide and rule politics and trying to pit the elders, so to speak, against the youths. we got involved very much in that because Manchester was allowing communities to come from Bolton, from Blackburn and everywhere, rigging votes in order to get Asian representatives onto Manchester City Council. And what was happening then was the Asian youth movement was being more and more isolated, including by the Central Mosque in Victoria Park, because they were seen as radicals who were wanting to undermine the settlement that the state had made with that generation. So I think it's important for us to understand those links and understand that they never really went away. As we saw after the riots around the place in 1981 and subsequently. And I think what is crucial here is that there were parallel movements amongst African youths and Asian youths, not just in Bradford and Manchester, but in London and elsewhere. So the come what may, we're here to stay, and we're here to stay and here to fight slogans were crucial in sending messages to the state that whatever they wanted to do in terms of separating sections of the population would not succeed.
Yeah, press this point on a little bit further, some of the things that you missed out. One of the important points was that we looked at the world on the political spectrum of Britain, and we had a slogan, Labour, Tory, both the same. Both play the racist game. And in one sense, that came so true with the passage of time. Only the blind would now not see what we were shouting and screaming in the 80s. But there were other common denominators. And one of the common denominators, yes, I want to repeat what Gus is saying, we not only did not see a division, we saw unity in the moment of organization of our own houses. So if St. Paul's in Bristol is set alight, we've got friends going over to do whatever we can do. If there were troubles in Liverpool, and the levels of unity went much beyond simply the questions of slogans on the street. We fought tooth and nail together. In East London, the people who were fighting were not simply Asians. There were definitely a lot of whites, there were a lot of Afro-Caribbean, and important for those of us who don't know in here, we had to learn that we weren't white. We didn't know we weren't white until we came here. When we learned we ourselves were not white, we suddenly realized there were no black people in Africa, they were Africans. I still remember it was like a shock that hit me when I began to realize that actually everything I believed had a fundamental lie attached to it. But there are other common denominators that actually linked us together. At the time when we begin the process of organization, and it's good, Gus, that you're referring to the mosques, Afghanistan was occupied. From Bradford, there was huge amounts of money going in to undermine us, recruit youth to go to Afghanistan to fight in that war. And when we were trying to organize, we probably were extremists in that sense, you know, that we stood against whatever the West was doing, but the common denominator here was the imperialist outpouring. So when Lancaster House meeting takes place in Edison Zavobo, those of you who are young and don't know, when this meeting takes place, we come over here in coach loads and van loads. This was the meeting which is the conclusion of this independence movement, in a sense, of Zimbabwe, at which Edison Zavobo speaks, and one of the speeches he makes is what following the shooting down of the aeroplane, if you remember this, and he says, if I am a terrorist for standing up for the rights of my people, so be it. And there was a long speech, I can't remember now with the thing, but that was resonating in our lives as well. So in one sense, the question of color was not important. Two other dimensions and diameters were. One was class, and the other was the national liberation struggles. Yes. And that was as important for us to support the Irish, and we paid a very dear price. We were physically attacked, we were bricked, I mean, right including on the roads right here down Rimslow Road. But in the moment when the Bradford 12 were imprisoned, the level of solidarity that is shown wasn't simply by the street solidarity outside, but also by prisoners inside, as well as by the Republican movement post, supporting within Ireland, and the Republican prisoners supporting within jail. But in one sense then, the whole way of the swinging of the spectrum is Afghanistan is once again occupied. The forces are different. Syria is being destroyed. The forces are different. They're being recruited over here. We're yet again on the other side of the fence, with a slight difference now that at that time we believed our right to defeat British imperialism. It was not a negotiable thing. We wanted the Irish to win. We wanted the people of Zimbabwe to win. We did not want to simply oppose a war. We wanted the aggressor to be defeated. And in that sense, if we go around that long thing, it's because of the taking out of anti-imperialism from within the movement that leads to it. But I'd like to finish in the sense that the defeat of these movements is not really important. The fact that they existed, that's important. All things die in due time, but it's what they leave behind at the moment of their vibrancy of life. That's what gives the future an impetus to change in another direction, and that will change yet again.
I think one of the strongest things for me is the secular nature of the AYN, and what I'm interested in, because we're at a time now where, particularly for Asian communities, younger Asian people identify very much with a religion, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and so on. So what I'm interested in is what took place in the early days. Because was it a conscious decision? Was it accidental? I know there was early influences from the IWA and so on. And what sort of debates took place about the role of religion at that time?
I think it was that the Asian youth movements were not defined by faith. Their interest was in a particular politics, and that's in a sense where they were coming from. It didn't matter whether you were Jain or Hindu or Sikh or Christian or anything else. When you look at the Bradford 12, in fact, they were Sikh, they were Christian, they were Hindu, and they were Muslim.
Catholic.
A Muslim. Catholic. And, when you think about that, you've got 4 faiths in 12 faiths. That was not the relevant issue. But it's really important not to get caught up in this issue around the secularism of the Asian youth movement. Yes, they were secular, and they included everybody. But the problem is today is that when we speak about secularism is being used to attack Muslims for organizing against Islamophobia. Now, the thing is that the Asian youth movements were concerned to defend those that were facing oppression from the state and on the street, and they understood the way in which oppression operated, not just on sort of local levels or national levels, but on international levels. And the global dynamics have changed. And since the sort of beginning of the so-called war on terror, we've seen the shift from before, during the Cold War, it was communists, then it became Muslims. So that, I remember there was a speech that Shivanandan did after the First Gulf War, and he said, we're all Muslims now. In a similar way, that at that time, if we had been called Pakis, you wouldn't turn around and say, I'm an Indian, because we knew that the attack was, in a sense, on us as black people. And that, in a sense, is the same, and that's where the kind of the disintegration into cultural organizations has made it much more difficult to form those kinds of unities. But if you're attacked as a Muslim, you have a right to defend yourself as a Muslim. And when you think about at the end of the book, I've got a short bit on secularism. It's just a beginning, because I really didn't know what to write, to be honest with you. But I wanted to think about that very issue because I'd started off by talking about the secular identities of the Asian youth movement, and I'd started off building the archive because I was so fed up of being defined as, you know, well, I was supposed to, I don't know what I was supposed to be. Was I supposed to be Hindu or Christian or Quaker or Muslim or, I don't know, you know, I've got so many faiths in my family, it would be difficult to know where to start. Because I wanted to look at that very issue, and when you think about the organisations that are forming, as I have a really poor memory, I'm going to try and find the names in here. But you know, there've been organisations that are now being formed that include, you know, Muslims for a Secular Democracy, Council of Ex-Muslims in Britain. These organisations have been formed, in a sense, to Muslims for a Secular Democracy. What do you mean? As though the Western Muslims against, you know, democracy? It's just, you know, the ways in which secularism is used. It's a bit like the way in which the Americans use the term freedom, as though they own this concept. They mean freedom for themselves and nobody else. It's a bit like Roman democracy, you know, democracy for the Romans, but not for the slaves. You know, it's that kind of a concept. So we have to be, I think, really careful of how we use that term secularism today because of the attack. And the youth did not want to do that. The youth wanted to defend those that were facing oppression.
Historically based on that. I think what happened was very much affecting our communities. It made no difference at that time whether you were called African or whether you were called Caribbean. You faced the same oppression. So what the response was about the oppression that you faced, rather, because the oppressor didn't make any differentiation between the oppressed. It was just, they just saw faces, and that was what they were interested in. So like us, whether you're African, whether you come from the Congo, or whether you came from Martinique, where it made no difference. They just saw, everybody was treated the same. So that the response, therefore, reflected that sort of oppression.
I just want to make a very quick comment on the idea of secularism. I am not secular. We never were secular. An individual cannot be secular, a country can. I cannot necessarily believe in religion or believe in religion. It's not a contradiction. Britain is not a secular country. The issue lies within the state. It's the analysis that we had was with the state. That was our primary enemy. Others were our friends. We had to search for them, including the racist, some of the racists within the working class movement. We had to go and build those alliances. So in one sense, Raj, there's a complete confusion of even independence, countries that are now occupied. Secularism is irrelevant. The first point is to have independence, get the foreign boots off your back. Then we'll discuss, do we want a secular state or do we want a religious state? These are not important. They're important to me because I might represent a socialist tendency. But the most important aspect is that secularism is a clobbering stick now within Britain, and those examples you give.
Yeah, and just to reminded me from what you were saying is that we can understand it as a sort of a battering ram for Muslims when we think about the fact that after the 7/7 bombing, the Labour Party set up a committee on integration and cohesion, right? And this was all, you know, we need cohesion, we need integration. Basically, it's again, Muslim bashing, because you've heard of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. Well, they had a member, right, Ramesh Kalidas, secretary of the Hindu Forum, linked to this right-wing, practically fascist Hindu organization as part of this, committee for integration and cohesion. So it was all right having that lot on there, but they weren't going to have any, Muslim Council of Britain or anything, So you can see what the agenda is there. It's so clear. It's just that we're never given access to those kind of information. Gus?
I just want to make two quick comments. I think
The history you've assembled for us, and for that we thank you, allows for some possibilities. I am one of those who, for the last God knows how many decades, have been campaigning against stop and search. Since 7/7 and Blair's war on terror, something that was seen as being exclusive to these wayward, lawless Caribbeans and Africans is now centrally an issue for Muslims and non-Muslims from South Asian communities. So that you have these thousands of arrests and stops every year, and from them you have less than 100 people being actually prosecuted.
If you're Asian in this country, you're 42% times more likely to be stopped.
Okay, precisely. So what I'm saying is, I am hopeful that there can be a movement of, whether they be young or older Asians, and all of those Caribbean young people who are seen as surplus to the requirements of the economy, chucked out of school, stopped by the police routinely, day after day after day. I've got a nephew who's just left Manchester to go and do his 1-year sandwich course. He's doing French. Lives in London, not far from where I currently live. And 14 times in the space of a month, he's actually stopped by the police. And I mean, people talk about racial profiling, they don't even begin to understand the depth of that in our communities. So it seems to me that in the same way that the politics of the 70s and 80s gave rise to those alliances between the AYM, ourselves, and so forth, one longs to see that now in relation to not just the stop and search issue, but a whole range of other things besides, to do with youth and employment and marginalization and all the rest of it. The other thing I want to say is this: you mentioned quite rightly Garrett's observation about, if you like, how our politics and those struggles radicalize them as lawyers. Ian MacDonald will say the same thing about the Mangrove 9 trial in 1969, on which he cut his own legal teeth. I think what is interesting about the period we're talking about is that that too has spawned some radical lawyers. Barley Gill, Southall Monitoring Group, the Monitoring Group, Rajiv Rajiv Menon from the New Monitoring Group, who then went and joined MacDonald in his chambers at Two Garden Court. Hossein, who worked on the cases in Burnley, and so on. So those people coming out of that particular politics are now doing really quite amazing things as human rights lawyers, criminal lawyers who understand the political dimension of the cases that they're dealing with in our communities and so on. And I think that has got to be acknowledged as well.
No, absolutely. But what's needed alongside those lawyers is we need the campaigns, we need the grassroots campaigns in order to support the people that they're fighting for. We've got a young person here, maybe he'll be the one to start.
I just wanted to say two things.
One was that I think partly when you're talking about Asians as not just the group that we nowadays call Asians, as more than one group, blacks, Asians, nearly everyone, I think that was by a common sense, they came together by a common sense of exclusion from the British society. And that's why, when you're talking about fragmentation nowadays, it's because I think that they feel less needed. So, because racism levels have seemingly gone down, they feel less needed and they don't unite anymore against racism. And the other thing was the war on terror that people are talking about. In America, the statistics say you're more likely to be killed in the bathtub than by a terrorism attack. So if you spend...
Because fear is used, isn't it? Fear is used to legitimate state actions. Actions which end up being repressive, to all of us. And we see that, for example, 2001, the kind of draconian sentences that young Asians faced after those riots. Then in 2011, you see it used against working class whites in Salford and elsewhere. Unless anyone wants to take one.
Sorry, yeah, that's a really good question. It was about, I'm really interested in listening to some of the discussion on the video about how people organise in terms of having runners and so forth. And really my question's about organisation then and organisation today, in the sense that the whole new social media and so forth is undoubtedly in many respects has had a great impact in terms of being able to communicate and organise. But it's sold in that respect, but in many respects it's actually a tool for kind of like pacification actually a tool of pacification. So if you think about, it can become sort of an attractive alternative, or appear to be an attractive alternative to start, hashtagging against things, or and I think that I'm just interested to know, is there anything from the kind of narratives that you've collected that could be used in order to reflect on the importance of perhaps the reclaiming
I'll tell you one
space
thing.
and so
It's a
forth.
really comment that was made. This was made in relation to when Bradford took state funding, and before they took Bradford Achievement took state funding, they used to collect 25 pence from each of the members, and the 25 pence was all put into a pot. And they had, one of their members was a full-time organizer, Tariq, in fact, and he would be paid out of that pot. Now, in order for the money to be collected, someone had to go around and talk to all the members and collect the 25 pence. And there was communication, there was proper communication between all of the people in this organization. The minute funding came in, well, there was no point collecting those 25 pence. Because you had all this funding coming in anyway. You had £2,000. Why are you going to go and take 25 pence off someone that's earning the minimum wage? You're not going to do that. So then there's a disintegration of organisation, and that's what it comes down to. It's the power of organisation. And it doesn't matter how much virtual communication you have. There's nothing like actually meeting, talking, discussing, in forums, in groups, with individuals. You can't bypass it. I mean, as I'm a union organizer in my place of work, and we have seen, we've started to go around door to door talking to our members. We started this last year, and people couldn't believe it. They said, I've been here for 12 years, I've never seen the UCU branch officer, in any of these buildings. And we have, we're slowly increasing our membership, because at the end of the day, you have to organize. If you want to build something, you have to organize, and there isn't really a shortcut to it. Yes, social networks, email, all of these things can make communication faster, and there are certain forms of communication that's fantastic for. But if you're building something, that involves much
part can happen online. It's more the actual being in space, in the space,
spaces,
and actually organising. And I don't think that's necessarily recognised by everybody in terms of the culture of today, about the social media. And it's just really, I just know that if I'm hashtagging, protect human rights, I don't think Theresa May is really that bothered. But if I'm out on the street protesting about it, I think she might notice a bit more. So
I'm going to to let Nilofer, you had your hand up, and as a form of, do you want to say you can finish
the only thing I was going to say is about taking the state funding also meant that there was a lot of barriers and you had to meet certain criteria of that funding, so it didn't allow you to do what
the former work that you did, the campaign work. You were too involved in meeting the criteria. Absolutely. Well, thank you to everyone. Unless anyone want to add, it's fantastic to have had all these, the contributions.
Just want to say the books. Yeah,
The books are outside, I think.
We've got books for sale, haven't we? We've still got some.
We have them, let's be sold out.
Yeah, we have got some of Not Anandi's book here for sale tonight.
There's only one left.
It's just a great line.